The champagne glass slipped from my fingers the moment my father stood up. Shards scattered across the Persian rug, but I barely noticed. "We've revised our will," he said, as if announcing the weather. The words hit like a punch. My hand cut on crystal, but I barely felt it. My parents' favorite words, practical, tidy, consolidate, echoed through the room, all pointed directly at me. Lucia laughed nervously, trying to make light of my silence. "Dad, you don't have to, no, it's the right thing," Mom chimed in, her voice too bright. "Anna, honey, you understand, don't you?" With your situation, I stared at them, the betrayal sharp and immediate. 37 years of being overlooked, dismissed, and measured against my sister, reduced to a situation in a single sentence. I bent down to pick up the pieces of the glass. Blood pricked my palm. And that's when I remembered the envelope I'd found last month, hidden in Mom's desk. The documents that would turn tonight on its head. I smiled. They had no idea what was coming. "My name is Ana Torres, and I need to tell you about the night that broke my family apart, and how one forgotten photograph put it back together in a way none of us saw coming." The champagne flute slipped from my fingers the moment my father stood up. I should have seen it coming. The way Mom had avoided eye contact during dinner, how Dad kept checking his watch like he was waiting for something. Even the timing felt deliberate, waiting until Lucia had been home for exactly 2 hours, just long enough for her to shake off her jet lag and settle into the living room where she belonged, where she'd always belonged. "Before we get too carried away celebrating Lucia's homecoming," Dad said, his voice carrying that particular tone he used for board meetings, "your mother and I have some family business to discuss." The crystal hit the hardwood floor with a sound like breaking bones. I bent to pick up the pieces, my cheeks burning with the familiar shame of being clumsy, of drawing attention to myself at the wrong moment. But as I crouched there, surrounded by glittering shards, I heard the words that would change everything. "We've revised our will." My hands stopped moving. A piece of glass bit into my palm. "Lucia, sweetheart, given your recent promotion at Goldman Sachs and your..." He paused, glancing at me kneeling on the floor. "More stable life situation, we've decided to consolidate the estate. It just makes more practical sense." Lucia's laugh was nervous, high-pitched. "Dad, you don't have to, no, it's the right thing," Mom chimed in, her voice artificially bright. "Anna, honey, you understand, don't you? With your difficulties, the divorce, the children, that little job at the bookstore." That little job. 37 years old, and my mother still talked about my work like it was a hobby. Never mind that I'd been supporting Marcus and Sophia on that little job for 3 years while their father played house with his 25-year-old graduate student. "The house will go to Lucia entirely," Dad continued, as if I weren't bleeding on their Persian rug. "Along with the investments and the life insurance policies. We've set up a small trust for the grandchildren, of course." The grandchildren. Not my children. The grandchildren. I stood slowly, cradling my bleeding hand against my chest. "When did you decide this?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Around me, the living room that had been my childhood sanctuary suddenly felt foreign. The family photos on the mantel seemed to mock me, images of Christmas mornings and birthday parties where I'd always stood slightly to the left, slightly out of focus, while Lucia commanded center stage. "We've been thinking about it for a while," Mom said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Since the divorce was finalized. We just want to make sure everything is tidy." Tidy. My life's destruction was an inconvenience that needed to be cleaned up. Lucia finally spoke, her voice small. "Anna, I had no idea they were going to." "Of course you didn't." The words came out sharper than I intended. "You never have any idea, do you?" She flinched, and I felt a stab of something that might have been guilt. But it was overwhelmed by something larger, darker. A rage that had been building for years, fed by every family dinner where Dad asked about Lucia's work but not mine, every holiday where Mom fussed over Lucia's latest boyfriend while avoiding the topic of my imploding marriage. Anna, Dad's voice carried warning. Let's be reasonable about this. Reasonable. The word tasted like metal in my mouth. Reasonable? I repeated, surprised by how calm I sounded. Like it was reasonable to wait until tonight to tell me? Like it was reasonable to discuss this without me? The silence stretched between us, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. That clock had been in our family for 4 generations. I'd grown up listening to its rhythm during countless dinners in this same room. Now I realized I'd never hear it again, not as a daughter coming home, anyway. Mom's hand fluttered to her throat, a nervous gesture I remembered from childhood. Sweetheart, you have to understand, we're not getting any younger. We need to plan for the future, and Lucia is just in a better position to what? I stepped closer, glass still embedded in my palm, drops of blood marking my path across the floor. To handle your legacy? To be the good daughter? To not embarrass you? That's not what this is about, Dad said, but his eyes said otherwise. I looked around the room one more time, at the piano where I'd practiced for hours as a child while Lucia played outside, at the window seat where I'd hidden to read while family parties swirled around me, at the photo of my grandparents that had watched over every significant moment of our lives. No, I said quietly. This is exactly what it's about. Lucia stood up suddenly, her perfectly manicured hands twisted together. Anna, please, can we just talk about this? Maybe there's a way to what? Share? I laughed, and the sound was bitter even to my own ears. When have we ever shared anything, Lucia? The question hit its target. Her face crumpled slightly, and I felt that familiar pang of guilt. Growing up, I'd convinced myself that our parents' favoritism wasn't her fault. That she couldn't help being everything they wanted in a daughter, successful, married to the right kind of man, living the right kind of life. But standing there in the wreckage of my family's announcement, I realized something I'd never admitted before: she'd never once stood up for me. Not when Dad dismissed my art degree as impractical. Not when Mom made cutting comments about my choice to marry a teacher instead of a lawyer. Not when they'd both made it clear that my struggles were somehow a personal failing rather than simple bad luck. She'd stood by and watched them diminish me for 37 years. And now she was inheriting the reward for her silence. I think, I said, wrapping my bleeding hand in a dinner napkin, I need some air. I walked toward the front door, my heels clicking against the marble entryway, the same entryway where I'd posed for prom pictures, where I'd stood in my wedding dress 6 years ago, where I'd broken down crying the night David asked for a divorce. Behind me, I heard Lucia call my name, but I didn't turn around. Outside, the October air bit at my skin, and I realized I'd left my jacket inside. I wouldn't be going back for it. Instead, I sat on the porch steps where I'd waited for school buses and first dates and rides to soccer practice, and I stared at my parents' house like I'd never seen it before. The warm light spilling from the windows, the perfectly maintained garden, the circular driveway that had always made me feel like we were living in a movie about someone else's life, all of it felt like a stage set now. A beautiful facade hiding something rotten underneath. My phone buzzed. A text from Lucia: please come back inside. We can figure this out. I stared at the words for a long moment, then deleted the message without responding. That's when I remembered the envelope tucked away in my bedroom closet. The one I'd found while cleaning out Mom's desk last month when she'd asked me to organize her paperwork. The one containing documents that would make tonight's announcement look like a gentle misunderstanding. I smiled for the first time in hours. They had no idea what was coming. The drive home was a blur of streetlights and rage. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel, the makeshift bandage around my palm already soaked through. Every red light felt like an eternity, every turn a reminder that I was driving away from the only family I'd ever known and toward a duplex apartment that still felt temporary 3 years after the divorce. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for a full 5 minutes, staring at the yellow light spilling from Sophia's bedroom window. 12 years old and already more emotionally mature than my parents. She'd probably spent the evening helping Marcus with his math homework while I played dress-up at what I'd thought was a family celebration. The front door creaked as I pushed it open, another item on the endless list of things I couldn't afford to fix. The babysitter, Mrs. Chen from next door, looked up from her crossword puzzle with raised eyebrows. "You're back early," she said, taking in my appearance. "Everything all right, honey?" I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror and winced. Mascara smudged under my eyes, hair escaping from its careful updo, blood seeping through the napkin wrapped around my hand. I looked like I'd survived something, which I supposed I had. Family dinner ran shorter than expected, I managed. How were they? Angels, as always. Mrs. Chin gathered her things, but her eyes lingered on my bandaged hand. Sophia finished her science project, and Marcus only needed help with one math problem. They had cereal for dinner. I hope that's okay. Cereal for dinner while I'd sat through 5 courses of passive-aggressive small talk and character assassination disguised as estate planning. That's perfect. Thank you. After she left, I climbed the stairs, pausing outside each bedroom door. Sophia's room glowed with the soft light of her reading lamp. She'd inherited my inability to fall asleep without a book. From Marcus's room came the gentle whir of his white noise machine, the one we'd bought to help him sleep through the arguments during the divorce. I pressed my forehead against Sophia's door and listened to the soft sound of pages turning. My brilliant, sensitive daughter who'd asked me last week if we were poor because her friend Megan's mom had mentioned that some families couldn't afford the ski trip the PTA was planning. Some families. Code for us. I pushed the door open gently. Sophia looked up from her book, something about marine biology, and her expression immediately shifted to concern. "Mom? You look like I got hit by a truck?" I sat on the edge of her bed, careful not to jostle her. "How was your evening?" "Fine." Mrs. Chen helped Marcus with fractions, and I finished my project on ocean acidification. She closed her book, marking her place with a theater ticket stub from our last trip to see a show downtown. "But you didn't answer my question. What happened at Aunt Lucia's thing?" Sophia had always been too observant for her own good. Even as a toddler, she'd watch family dynamics with the intensity of a social scientist, cataloging every slight intention for future reference. "Just family stuff," I said, then caught myself. I'd promised after the divorce that I wouldn't lie to them about important things. They deserved better than the careful omissions my parents had fed me growing up. "Actually, your grandparents made some decisions tonight that I wasn't expecting." "About money?" Her directness caught me off guard. "Why would you think that?" Sophia shrugged, but her eyes were serious. "You get a specific look when you're worried about money. And you've had that look a lot lately." 12 years old, and she was already learning to read the micro-expressions of financial anxiety. The thought made my chest tight. "We're okay," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. "We're going to be okay." She studied my face for a moment, then nodded. "Is that why your hand is bleeding?" I looked down at the napkin, now more red than white. "I broke a glass. Accident. Do you want me to help you clean it up?" The offer was so gentle, so matter-of-fact, that I almost started crying right there. Instead, I kissed her forehead and promised to take care of it properly. "Get some sleep, baby. School tomorrow. Love you, Mom." "Love you too." I closed her door and stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the silence of my house. No grandfather clock marking time here. No marble entryway or Persian rugs. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of settling wood. But it was mine. Ours. Whatever happened next, no one could take this away from us. In my bedroom, I finally unwrapped my hand properly. The cut was deeper than I'd thought, a clean slice across my palm that would definitely need stitches. But first, I had something to retrieve. The envelope sat exactly where I'd left it, tucked between old photo albums on the top shelf of my closet. I'd been organizing Mom's paperwork last month when she'd decided to simplify her filing system, and this particular envelope had been misfiled in a box of old tax documents. I'd almost thrown it away without looking. The return address meant nothing to me at the time, some law firm in Boston I'd never heard of. But something about the formal weight of the paper, the way it had been sealed with actual wax rather than just glue, had made me curious. Now, sitting on my bed with blood dripping onto my comforter, I opened it again and spread the contents across my nightstand. The photographs were black and white, clearly from the 1960s based on the clothing and cars visible in the background. But it wasn't the era that made them significant, it was the faces. My father, young and lean, standing next to a man I didn't recognize outside what looked like a courthouse. Both men were smiling, shaking hands, but there was something about their posture that suggested a transaction rather than a friendship. The second photograph showed the same unknown man handing my father an envelope. In the background, a sign was partially visible: Riverside Development Project, future home of. The rest was cut off, but I'd seen enough. Attached to the photographs was a single sheet of letterhead from Morrison, Klein and Associates, dated 1967. The language was dense legal terminology, but certain phrases jumped out: consultation fees, environmental impact waiver, expedited permits. At the bottom, 2 signatures, the unknown man's and my father's. I'd been staring at these documents for weeks, trying to understand their significance. Night, after watching my parents casually erase me from their legacy, the pieces finally clicked into place. The Riverside Development Project had been the biggest environmental scandal in our county's history. Wetlands destroyed, wildlife habitat eliminated, water tables contaminated, all for a shopping center that had made millions for its developers while poisoning the community for decades. And my father, the man who'd spent my entire childhood lecturing me about integrity and responsibility, had been paid to expedite the permits that made it all possible. My phone buzzed. Another text from Lucia: "Anna, please call me. I'm worried about you." I set the phone aside without responding and picked up the photograph again. The quality was remarkable for its age, every detail crystal clear, including the date stamp in the corner, June 15, 1967. 3 months before I was born. The irony was almost poetic. The money that had funded my privileged childhood, that had paid for Lucia's private school and my art degree and this very house we'd all grown up in, all of it had come from the destruction of the place I'd spent every summer learning to love nature. Riverside Park had been my refuge growing up. The place I'd gone to think, to cry, to dream about a future that seemed brighter than my present. I'd brought David there on our first date. I'd taken Marcus and Sophia there to feed ducks and collect interesting stones. None of us had ever known we were playing in a graveyard. I pulled out my phone and took a picture of the photograph, making sure the date and both faces were clearly visible. Then I searched for the contact information I'd looked up weeks ago but never used. Morrison, Klein and Associates was long defunct, but their successor firm was very much alive. Henderson and Associates, probate lawyers who specialized in high-net-worth estate planning. The same firm my parents had used to revise their will. My finger hovered over the phone number for a long moment. Once I made this call, there would be no going back. The family that had just discarded me would discover I wasn't as powerless as they'd assumed. But as I sat there in my modest bedroom, listening to my children sleep in rooms that might not be ours much longer, I realized I'd been going back my entire life. Back to their expectations, their disappointment, their carefully managed version of love that came with conditions and fine print. I dialed the number. It went straight to voicemail, which I should have expected at nearly 11 on a Friday night. But the automated message gave me exactly what I needed: an email address for urgent matters. I attached the photograph and typed a single line: "I believe this document may be relevant to the Henderson family estate planning. We should meet." I hit send before I could change my mind. Then I bandaged my hand properly, changed into pajamas, and lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow would bring consequences I couldn't fully predict. But for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of what came next. I was curious. The emergency room at St. Mary's was surprisingly quiet for a Saturday morning. I'd spent the night replaying every moment of the previous evening, my hand throbbing with each heartbeat, until I finally accepted that the cut needed professional attention. The triage nurse, a woman about my age with kind eyes and calloused hands, examined the wound with practiced efficiency. "How did this happen?" she asked, cleaning the area with antiseptic that burned worse than the original injury. "Broke a glass at a family dinner." She glanced up at me, and something in her expression suggested she'd heard that explanation before. "Must have been some dinner." "You could say that." She worked in comfortable silence for several minutes, preparing the suture kit. I found myself studying her hands, steady, capable, unmarked by any wedding ring. There was something reassuring about her competence, the way she moved through her routine without drama or fanfare. "I'm a single mom too," she said quietly, beginning the first stitch. I started. "How did you? The way you checked your phone 3 times in 5 minutes. The fact that you're here alone on a Saturday morning instead of having someone drive you. The look in your eyes like you're calculating how much this is going to cost versus how much you can afford. She pulled the thread through gently. Plus, I've been where you are. Different circumstances, same feeling. The tears came without warning, hot and embarrassing. I'm sorry, I don't usually cry in emergency rooms. Honey, if I had $1 for every strong woman who's broken down in this chair, I could retire. She handed me a tissue without looking up from her work. What happened to your family? The question was so direct, so matter-of-fact, that I found myself answering honestly for the first time in hours. My parents cut me out of their will last night. In favor of my sister. Ouch. Another stitch. Any particular reason? I got divorced. I work at a bookstore. I have children who need cereal for dinner sometimes. The words came out more bitter than I intended. Apparently, that makes me unstable. Sounds like that makes you human. She glanced up briefly. How old are your kids? 12 and 9. Good ages. Old enough to understand when life gets complicated, young enough to still think you're magical. She finished the last stitch and began wrapping my hand. My daughter's 15 now. When her dad left, my mother told me I was damaged goods and that I should consider giving custody to my ex-husband's parents so she could have a stable home. I stared at her. What did you do? Proved her wrong. She secured the bandage with tape. Every single day for 3 years. Till she finally admitted that maybe she'd been hasty in her judgment. My phone buzzed against the metal chair. I glanced down and felt my breath catch. The email was from Mr. Henderson himself, not an assistant. The timestamp showed 6:47 a.m. Ms. Torres, thank you for reaching out. I believe a meeting would indeed be beneficial for all parties involved. Would Monday at 9 a.m. work for your schedule? Also, I should mention that I've been expecting this conversation for quite some time. We have much to discuss. James Henderson, the nurse, noticed my expression. Good news or bad news? I'm not sure yet. She handed me a care instruction sheet and a small bottle of pain medication samples. Either way, you'll handle it. Women like us always do. By the time I got home, both kids were up and moving through their Saturday morning routine. Marcus sat at the kitchen table, still in his dinosaur pajamas, methodically working his way through a bowl of cereal while reading the back of the box. Sophia was already dressed, her dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, scrambling eggs with the focused concentration she brought to everything. Mom. Marcus looked up as I walked in, then immediately noticed the bandage. What happened to your hand? Just a little cut. Nothing serious. I kissed the top of his head, breathing in the familiar scent of his shampoo mixed with sleep. How are my favorite people this morning? Sophia made breakfast, Marcus announced proudly. She used real eggs and everything. I can see that. I turned to Sophia, who was plating the eggs with the same attention to detail she brought to her school projects. Thank you, sweetheart. You didn't have to, you look tired. She handed me a plate, studying my face with those serious dark eyes. And you're wearing the same clothes from yesterday. Nothing got past her. I had trouble sleeping. Because of the family stuff? I settled into the chair across from Marcus, accepting the coffee Sophia had somehow managed to make without burning down the kitchen. The normalcy of Saturday morning felt surreal after the chaos of the previous night. Yes, because of the family stuff. Sophia joined us at the table, her own plate barely touched. She had a habit of forgetting to eat when she was thinking through complex problems. Are we going to be okay? The question hung in the air like incense. Marcus looked up from his cereal, suddenly alert to the adult undercurrents swirling around our breakfast table. I thought about lying, about offering the kind of reassuring platitudes parents are supposed to provide. But these children had already lived through their father leaving, through the financial strain and the awkward custody arrangements and the subtle ways their world had shifted. They deserved the truth, even if it wasn't comfortable. I don't know yet, I said finally. There might be some changes coming. But we'll face them together, whatever they are. Marcus reached across the table and patted my uninjured hand with sticky fingers. It'll be okay, Mama. You always figure things out. The casual confidence in his voice nearly undid me. 9 years old, and he already understood that life required constant figuring out. But somehow, he still believed I was capable of managing whatever came next. My phone rang. Lucia's name flashed on the screen. I let it go to voicemail. It rang again immediately. You should probably answer that, Sophia said quietly. She called 4 times while you were gone. I picked up on the third ring. Anna, thank God. Lucia's voice was strained, exhausted. I've been calling all night. Where are you? Home. I drove by your house this morning, and your car wasn't there. The admission surprised me. Lucia rarely ventured into my neighborhood, too far from her world of boutique coffee shops and yoga studios. The thought of her sitting in my driveway, waiting for me to come home, stirred something complicated in my chest. I had to get my hand looked at. I cut it deeper than I thought. Oh God, Anna. I'm so sorry. About last night, about all of it. I had no idea they were planning, didn't you? The question came out sharper than I intended, but I didn't soften it. Not even a hint? Not even a casual conversation about how worried they were about my situation? Silence on the other end. Then, quietly, they've mentioned being concerned. About the kids, about your finances. But I never thought they would. What exactly did they say about the kids? More silence, longer this time. Lucia. They worry that you're not providing them with the same opportunities we had growing up. The private schools, the cultural enrichment, the sense of superiority? The casual racism disguised as standards? The belief that money equals worth? That's not fair. Isn't it? I stood up, moving to the kitchen window so the kids couldn't see my face. Tell me, when was the last time Mom asked about Sophia's grades? Or Marcus's soccer team? When was the last time Dad spent more than 5 minutes talking to them about anything other than whether they're applying themselves? The silence stretched between us. In the background, I could hear classical music playing, probably from her pristine kitchen where she and Richard ate organic everything and discussed their stock portfolios over fair trade coffee. I'm trying to fix this, she said finally. How? I'm meeting with Henderson on Monday morning. I'm going to tell him I want to split everything evenly. 50-50, the way it should have been from the beginning. I almost laughed. That's generous of you. Anna, please. I know you're angry, but we're still family. We can work this out. Family. The word felt foreign now, like something I'd learned in a language I no longer spoke fluently. I have to go, I said. The kids need me. Wait, I hung up and turned back to my children, both watching me with expressions too mature for their ages. Sophia had abandoned any pretense of eating and was methodically shredding her napkin into tiny pieces. Marcus had finished his cereal but remained at the table, sensing that adult business was still unfolding around him. Was that Aunt Lucia? Sophia asked. Yes. Is she trying to fix things? Such a simple question, such a complicated answer. She's trying, I said finally. But some things can't be fixed the way people think they can. Sophia nodded like this made perfect sense. When Dad said he'd try harder, but he kept working late anyway. The observation hit me like a physical blow. My daughter had been watching, cataloging, learning that promises and actions were often unrelated. That trying was sometimes just another word for maintaining the status quo while appearing concerned. Something like that. My phone buzzed with a text. Then another. Then a third. All from my mother. Anna, please call us. We need to discuss this situation. Your father is very upset about how you left last night. Your father is upset. Not about the situation, not about the pain they'd caused, but about my reaction to it. About the inconvenience of my emotional response to their calculated betrayal. I deleted the messages without reading them fully. Mom? Marcus's voice was small. Are Grandma and Grandpa mad at us? The question broke something inside me. Not mad at me, at us. He was already learning to carry the weight of adult conflicts, already wondering what he'd done wrong. No, baby. They're not mad at you. This is grown-up stuff that has nothing to do with how much they love you. The lie tasted like ash, but some truths were too heavy for 9-year-old shoulders. My phone rang again. This time, it was a number I didn't recognize. Ms. Torres? This is James Henderson. I apologize for calling on a Saturday, but I wanted to confirm our Monday appointment. Also, I think you should know, I've been contacted by your sister this morning. She's requested a meeting as well. I stepped into the hallway, lowering my voice. What kind of meeting? She wants to discuss revising the will again. She seems to think a more equitable distribution would resolve the current tension. I thought about Lucia's offer to split everything, her attempt to solve a lifetime of inequality with a simple mathematical adjustment. Mr. Henderson, have you had a chance to look at the photograph I sent? A pause. I have. And Ms. Torres? I think Monday's conversation is going to be very interesting indeed. He hung up, leaving me standing in my narrow hallway, surrounded by the comfortable chaos of my children's lives. Soccer cleats by the door, Sophia's science fair project still spread across the dining room table, Marcus's artwork covering the refrigerator like colorful prayers. This was my world. Imperfect, financially precarious, but real in ways my childhood home had never been. On Monday, I would find out if it was enough. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of October weather that made everything look sharper, more defined. I dropped the kids at school with careful normalcy, Sophia's lunch packed with her favorite sandwiches, Marcus's backpack double-checked for his library book, but my hands shook slightly as I kissed them goodbye. You look fancy, Sophia observed, taking in my navy blazer and the careful makeup I'd applied to hide the sleepless circles under my eyes. I have an important meeting. The kind that changes things? Sometimes I wondered if my daughter was actually 37 and I was the 12-year-old. Maybe. She hugged me tighter than usual. Good luck, Mom. The drive downtown took 20 minutes through traffic that seemed determined to delay me. Every red light felt like a test of my resolve, every glimpse of my bandaged hand in the rearview mirror a reminder of how Friday night had shattered something irreparable. Henderson and Associates occupied the top 2 floors of a granite building that screamed old money and older secrets. The lobby smelled like leather and lemon oil, with Persian rugs that probably cost more than my annual salary spread across marble floors. I announced myself to the receptionist, a woman with silver hair and the kind of understated jewelry that suggested generational wealth. She smiled politely and offered coffee in bone china that I was afraid to touch. Mr. Henderson will see you now. His office was everything I'd expected, floor-to-ceiling law books, mahogany desk the size of my dining room table, windows overlooking the city where deals were made and lives were quietly destroyed. But James Henderson himself surprised me. Mid-50s, rumpled gray hair, wire-rimmed glasses that had seen better days. He looked more like a favorite professor than a power broker. Ms. Torres. He stood as I entered, gesturing toward a cluster of leather chairs away from his imposing desk. Please, let's sit somewhere more comfortable. This conversation is going to require honesty, and intimidation won't serve either of us. I settled into a chair that probably cost more than my car, watching him arrange papers on the coffee table between us. My photograph sat on top of the stack, along with several documents I didn't recognize. I've been practicing law for 32 years, he began, pouring water from a crystal pitcher into matching glasses. In that time, I've learned to recognize the difference between family disputes and family destruction. What happened Friday night falls into the latter category. You were there? No, but your sister called me at 6:30 Saturday morning. She was distraught. Seems she had no idea your parents were planning to revise their will. He picked up my photograph, studying it like a puzzle piece he'd been waiting years to place. She also had no idea about this. What exactly is this? Henderson opened a manila folder and spread its contents across the table. Legal documents, newspaper clippings, correspondence spanning decades. The paper trail of a scandal that had been carefully buried for over 50 years. The Riverside Development Project, he said, pointing to a newspaper headline from 1968, Environmental Groups Protest Wetland Destruction. Your father served on the County Planning Commission from 1965 to 1969. During that time, Riverside Industries needed specific environmental waivers to proceed with their shopping center construction. I stared at the documents, trying to piece together the timeline. The man in the photograph? Robert Riverside. He died in 1989, but his company went on to become one of the largest commercial developers in the state. Henderson pulled out another document, what looked like bank records. These are copies of deposits made to your father's personal account. 6 payments over 18 months, totaling nearly $200,000. In 1967 money. Equivalent to about $1.6 million today. He leaned back in his chair, watching my reaction carefully. Your father used his position to expedite permits and waive environmental requirements. The construction proceeded despite clear evidence that it would contaminate the water table and destroy critical wildlife habitat. I thought about every summer of my childhood, playing in the ruins of what had once been pristine wetlands, learning to love nature in the shadow of a shopping center that had destroyed it. The irony burned in my throat. How do you know all this? Because 30 years ago, I was a young associate at Morrison, Klein and Associates. I was assigned to help handle the legal aftermath when the environmental groups filed their lawsuit. We won, technically. The development had already been completed by the time the case went to trial. But the evidence of corruption was overwhelming. So why wasn't my father prosecuted? Henderson's expression grew grim. Because Robert Riverside had evidence of similar arrangements with half the planning commission. And because your father had just been elected to the state legislature on a platform of environmental protection. Prosecuting him would have brought down a dozen other officials and exposed a system of corruption that went far deeper than one shopping center. So they made a deal. Your father resigned from public office, citing family obligations. He used his political connections to build a successful consulting business. And everyone agreed to forget that the Riverside Development Project had ever involved anything inappropriate. I stared at the photograph again, seeing it with new eyes. My father's smile, which I'd initially read as friendly, now looked calculating. The handshake that had seemed casual was actually sealing a deal that would poison a community for generations. Why are you telling me this now? Because 18 months ago, the EPA announced a major cleanup initiative for sites contaminated during the 1960s development boom. Riverside is on their list. He pulled out a thick document marked with official seals. The cleanup is estimated to cost $47 million. And under the new liability laws, that cost will be shared among all parties who profited from the original contamination. My pulse quickened, including my father, including your father's estate. The EPA has been very thorough in their research. They know about the bribes, the expedited permits, the environmental waivers. They're coming, Ms. Torres. And when they do, your family's assets will be frozen pending the outcome of the investigation. The room went very quiet. Outside, traffic moved through the rain-slicked streets, people going about their lives unaware that entire families could be destroyed by choices made decades before they were born. How long do we have? The formal notification letters go out next week. Your parents probably have 6 months before the asset freezing begins, maybe 8 if their lawyers are creative. They don't know. No. And neither does your sister. Henderson gathered the papers into neat stacks. Which brings us to the interesting part of this situation. The will your parents signed Friday night? It's invalid under federal asset recovery laws. You can't transfer property that's subject to environmental liability claims. I felt something shift inside me, like tumblers falling into place in a complex lock. Meaning your sister can't inherit assets that don't legally exist. And meaning your parents' attempt to protect their legacy by cutting you out has actually positioned you as the only family member with clean hands when the EPA comes calling. I thought about Lucia's phone calls, her desperate attempts to fix the will, her guilt about inheriting everything while I got nothing. She had no idea she was fighting for the right to inherit a debt that would destroy her financially. What exactly are you suggesting? Henderson smiled for the first time since I'd entered his office. I'm not suggesting anything, Ms. Torres. I'm simply providing information that I believe you have a right to know. What you do with that information is entirely up to you. My phone buzzed. A text from Lucia, meeting with Henderson at 2 p.m. Going to fix this mess. I showed Henderson the message. He read it, then checked his appointment book. She'll be here in 3 hours, expecting to revise a will that's about to become meaningless. He looked at me over his glasses. The question is, do you want to be here when she arrives? I thought about Friday night, about the casual cruelty of my parents' announcement. About years of being treated as the disappointing daughter, the unstable one, the family member who needed to be managed rather than respected. What would happen if I were? That depends entirely on what you want to happen. I stood and walked to the window, looking down at the city where I'd grown up believing my family's version of our story. The rain had intensified, turning everything gray and fluid, washing the familiar landscape clean. Behind me, Henderson waited patiently while I made the decision that would determine whether I remained a victim of my family's choices or became the author of my own ending. When I turned back to face him, I knew exactly what I wanted to happen. I'll be here, I said. But first, I need to make a phone call. Henderson nodded and gestured toward his desk. Take your time. And Miss Torres, for what it's worth, I think your parents seriously underestimated who they were dealing with. I dialed my mother's number, listening to it ring while rain drummed against the windows 40 stories above the city that was about to discover just how expensive the past could be. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright with false cheer. Anna, sweetheart. I'm so glad you called. Your father and I were just saying we should all sit down and discuss. Mom, I interrupted gently. We need to talk, I repeated, watching Henderson discreetly gather his papers. About Riverside. The silence stretched so long I wondered if the call had dropped. When my mother finally spoke, her voice had lost all its artificial brightness. I don't know what you mean. Yes, you do. The development project. The bribes. The EPA investigation that's coming next week. Another silence. Then, barely above a whisper, how did you find out? The confession hit me like a physical blow. Part of me had hoped the documents were wrong, but the defeat in my mother's voice confirmed everything. Does it matter? What matters is that Lucia doesn't know. She's on her way to a lawyer's office right now, fighting for the right to inherit a $47 million debt. Anna, you have to understand. Stop. I'm not calling to hear justifications. You have exactly 1 hour to get to Henderson's office downtown. Both of you. We can't just. Yes, you can. Because if you're not here when Lucia arrives, she's going to find out about this from a stranger. And if that happens, you'll have betrayed both your daughters instead of just one. I hung up before she could respond. At exactly 1:47 p.m., my parents arrived looking like they'd aged a decade since Friday night. Dad's usually perfect hair was uncombed. Mom clutched her purse like a shield. They saw me in Henderson's reception area and stopped short. Anna. Dad's voice carried that familiar authority, but it sounded hollow. What are you doing here? Waiting for Lucia. Just like you should be. At exactly 2 p.m., Lucia arrived in a rush of expensive perfume and nervous energy, dressed in a power suit that announced serious business. She saw all of us and froze. What's going on? Why are you all? We need to talk, I said quietly. All of us. Henderson led us to his conference room, where he'd arranged the documents in neat stacks. I noticed he'd positioned my photograph face down. I think it would be best if Ms. Torres explained why she asked you all here, he began. Lucia looked between our parents and me, confusion deepening. Anna, what is this about? I reached across the table and turned over the photograph. It's about this. Lucia leaned forward, studying the black and white image. I watched her face change, first curiosity, then recognition, then horror. Dad? Is that you? He didn't answer. June 15, 1967, I said, my voice steady. 3 months before I was born. Dad took $200,000 in bribes to expedite environmental permits for a shopping center that poisoned the community water supply for 30 years. That's not. Lucia started, but the words died as she looked at our father's face. It gets worse. The EPA has opened an investigation. They're coming after everyone who profited from the contamination, including Dad's estate. Henderson opened the first folder. The environmental liability is estimated at $47 million. Under federal asset recovery laws, that debt transfers to the estate upon death. Any property, investments, or liquid assets will be frozen pending investigation. Lucia's hands shook as she reached for the documents. How much of the estate? All of it, Henderson said gently. The house, the investments, the life insurance policies. Everything. The silence was deafening. So the will, Lucia began, is meaningless, I finished. You can't inherit assets that legally don't exist. She stared at me across the table. You knew. You came here today. I suspected. Henderson confirmed it. Why didn't you tell me? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Because for once in my life, I wanted to know something you didn't. I wanted to sit in a room with all of you and not be the one who was surprised, who was left out, who was treated like she couldn't handle the truth. Lucia flinched like I'd slapped her. Mom finally spoke, barely above a whisper. Anna, we never meant for any of this to come out. Or to hurt people. Because those are two very different things. We thought it was over, Dad said. The project was completed, everyone moved on, you thought you'd gotten away with it. I kept my voice calm. And maybe you would have, if you hadn't decided I was too unstable to inherit the proceeds of your corruption. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. By trying to protect their legacy from my supposed irresponsibility, they'd made me the only family member who wouldn't be destroyed by their choices. Lucia was crying now, silent tears she wiped with her hand. So what happens now? Henderson answered. The EPA notification goes out Friday. You'll have approximately 6 months to liquidate any assets you want to protect. I'd recommend consulting with a bankruptcy attorney. And Anna? Mom's voice was hollow. Anna inherited nothing Friday night, remember? She has no legal connection to the contaminated assets. I looked around the table at my family, really looked at them, maybe for the first time. Dad, deflated and old. Mom, crying silently. Lucia, finally understanding she'd never been the favored daughter, just the designated inheritor of a debt she couldn't pay. There's something else, I said quietly. They all looked up. I've been thinking about what happens next. I pulled out my phone, showing them a screenshot. I called a real estate agent this morning. My house is worth about $300,000. Lucia frowned. Why does that matter? Because when your house is seized, you're going to need somewhere to live. All of you. I put my phone away. I'm offering to buy you out of your half of my house. 3 years ago, you helped with my down payment. Consider this a return on your investment. The proposal hit like a shockwave. You want us to live with you? Mom's voice was incredulous. I want my children to know their grandparents. I want Lucia to remember what it feels like to have a sister instead of a competitor. And I want all of us to figure out what we actually owe each other. It won't be easy, I continued. My house has 3 bedrooms and 1 bathroom. The hot water runs out if more than 2 people shower. The neighborhood isn't what you're used to. But it's paid for, and it's clean, and it's mine. Why? Lucia asked, her voice raw. After everything we put you through, because someone has to break the cycle. And because my children deserve to grow up in a family that chooses love over money, even when the money's gone. Dad finally looked up. Anna, don't apologize. Just decide. Henderson can draw up papers this week, or you can find somewhere else to figure out your next 47 years. I stood, gathering my purse and the photograph that had started everything. I'm going to pick up my children now. If you want to come home with me, you know where I live. I was almost to the door when Lucia called my name. Anna? What you said about knowing something I didn't. She paused, struggling with words that had probably never been spoken aloud in our family. I'm sorry. For all the times I let them treat you like you were less than me. I turned back to face her, this sister who'd been my rival and closest family member and greatest disappointment all at the same time. I know, I said. Now come home. 3 hours later, I was stirring pasta sauce when I heard car doors slamming in my driveway. Through the window, I watched my parents emerge from their Mercedes like refugees from their own lives, carrying suitcases and bewildered expressions. Lucia followed, helping Dad carry a box that probably contained the remnants of a life they thought they'd built securely. Sophia and Marcus pressed their faces to the living room window, watching their grandparents navigate the uneven pathway to our front door. Mom? Sophia called. Are they moving in? For a while, I called back, continuing to stir sauce that would somehow need to feed 7 people instead of 3. The doorbell rang, and Marcus raced to answer it, his voice bright with excitement as he welcomed his family to what was apparently now their home. I turned off the burner and wiped my hands on a dish towel, listening to the chaos of multiple generations trying to fit into a space designed for half their number. It was going to be complicated. It was going to be loud. It was probably going to be a disaster. But it was going to be honest. And for the first time in my life, that felt like enough.